You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor, powered by bbbgive.org. Here we explore the motivations that form the basis of giving and service. We inspire generosity and celebrate the transformative effects that giving and service have on the human spirit and on community. The conversations featured on the podcast also uncover giving strategies that educate and provide tools to help listeners make impactful gifts of both their time and money. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Heart of Giving podcast, powered by bbbgive.org. Give.org is the nation's standards-based charity evaluator and your one-stop source for information on giving and reports on the most asked about charities. I'm Art Taylor, your host, and with me today is the president of Independent Sector, Dan Cardinali. Dan has been the leader of Independent Sector now for 4 years, and prior to that, he spent quite a bit of time working in the education space, heading a major organization that works with young people to make sure that they're getting the best out of their educational opportunities. I want to talk with Dan today about the work of Independent Sector, and I also want to talk about his career. We'll get into some conversation about a memo that he released recently, calling for us to consider our sectarianism in the country and to look for unity over that sectarianism. We'll want to dig into that with a conversation in a bit and also explore with him what was on his mind as he was drafting that note. So thanks for being with us today, Dan.
Art, it's a pleasure to join you and just appreciate your leadership and that of BBB Wise Giving. You guys do amazing work and play an important role in the sector. So delighted to be here. Thank you.
You know, BBB Wise Giving Alliance has been a member of Independent Sector since its beginning, and I've personally been affiliated with the organization most of my career, either as a committee member on one of your committees or even as a board member for many years. And I was also the vice chair of the board of Independent Sector. I love the organization and the work it's doing, and certainly we're needed at this time. So Dan, tell us a little bit about Independent Sector, though, if you don't mind. There may be some listeners who don't know much about the organization.
Thanks, Art. And I'll be interested in your comments as well, given your tenure as a leader in the sector, and particularly your perch at BBB Wise Giving, as well as your tenure as a board member at Independent Sector. Independent Sector is a 40-year-old membership organization, really founded at a time by social entrepreneurs, Brian O'Connell and John Gardner, in response to the crisis at that point, where there was a fair amount of interest on government to overly regulate the sector. And leaders felt that it was important for a group from all different facets of the sector to come together. Those who were in endowed philanthropic institutions and grant-making organizations, nonprofits who were running, large and small enterprises, often grant-seeking organizations as well as the corporate community, and those particularly involved in the nexus between corporate social responsibility and corporate philanthropy and its impact on the sector. And they were charged with the wonderful and important role of caring about the integrity, the quality, the ethics, the trust, the accountability of the sector. And they came together, banded together into what eventually became known kind of more classically as a trade association. And over the years played a very important role, as you well know, Art, in partnering with Congress to ensure good legislation to support the sector and defend it at times when government wanted to overreach, as well as kind of calling the sector to self-regulate and to ensure that it held the highest standards of ethics and accountability. And then behind that was also a real recognition that there needed to be a place in the sector where leaders from all different kinds of organizations, large and small, community-based and international, philanthropic and nonprofit, could come together in a non-transactional way and really make sense of what was going on kind of at the sector level, all sharing their particular experiences, pooling that wisdom into a community, and out of that collective intelligence, kind of driving Independent Sector, the organization's policy work to ensure that we were really keeping our eyes on the health and the integrity of the sector, and also preparing where the sector needed to go. So we have about 500 members from the philanthropic and nonprofit and corporate social responsibility community. And on a good day, we're a good trade organization. On a great day, we're a leadership organization partnering with you and organizations like yours are to really collectively chart where the sector needs to go in response to this crazy changing world we're living in.
Yeah, so Dan, independent sector has been around for 40 years, as you mentioned. What do you see as some of the major changes in the organization, say, since you've been a board member, or maybe before that, that sort of mirrors what's needed to address some of the challenges in society today?
It's a great question. And again, Art, you've been a leader as a sector leader really for many, many years, much longer than I have. When I was a board member, and then when I stepped into this role, independent sector was at an important soul searching moment, having observed over the last 40 years an incredible explosion in the number of nonprofits and the professionalization of the field. There are about 12 million professional staff and 65 million volunteers every year and about 1.5 million nonprofits. 40 years ago, the sector was a fraction that size. And as the sector has grown, so have the various really wonderful organizations like BBB Wise Giving and many other organizations that think about providing specialized services, leadership training and accountability and finance training, strategic planning. And what independent sector as an organization was observing was we had gotten very much in the business of kind of service provision and membership services as driving our work. And we had taken our eyes a bit off of the prize of saying, well, whoa, how strong an organization are we in order to ask the question, how strong is the sector? So we began to really transition and reorganize ourselves to partner with sector leaders and organizations from, again, very small community-based organizations to the multinational nonprofits and philanthropic institutions to begin a process of really assessing how strong civil society was, and then to begin to launch a process collectively of ensuring we all took up our role, regardless of what our particular mission might be, in strengthening civil society. So very simply, we shifted our work into three very simple buckets. One is to publish every year, and then this year we'll start on a quarterly basis, this sector nonprofit health report that is really taking a look at the various dimensions of health for the sector. We look at financial health, we look at human capital, we look at leadership and governance, and we look at policy and advocacy, those kind of four quadrants. And we use a lot of public access data as well as some original research. And we compile a report as a way of like having a Dow Jones so that everyone can say, oh, we're doing well in these areas of financial health, but we have some worrisome numbers over here. So that report is about making sure everybody has the same fact base on how strong we are. Then the second strategy is bringing people together to make sense of that report and in light of their own lived experience. And that's our upswell and community building work. And that's now we do it about every other month through these upswell pop-ups. If you go to upswell.org, you can see all the information we did last year and see what we're going to be dealing with this year. And we organize that kind of meaning making, that community building work with the health report in mind, how well we're doing. And then we look at very important topics of the day. So we've been very focused on this moment of racial reckoning and the anti-racism movement that's being unleashed in the United States. And we're also deeply aware that the pandemic and the economic impact of the pandemic, along with the racial reconstruction that's underway, has really required the sector to chart a pathway forward. So the two themes of our community building work are anti-racism and then kind of COVID recovery, to use shorthand. And then the third thing is our public policy work, which I know you're very familiar with, where we really advocate listening to the community that comes together at Upswell and through our committee structure of our members, as well as through this health report. And we have a much more proactive agenda. Historically, we've been very good on defense. The charitable tax deduction is our kind of signature policy issue. But now we have something called the National Infrastructure Investment Advocacy Group, or NIAG, which is really talking about how government should be investing in civic infrastructure to really support the health and vitality of civil society. So we've shifted to really focusing on those things that are sector spanning, that has impacts both philanthropic institutions and nonprofits who are operating, and then look at both the interaction of what the academy through this report can tell us and what reflection from community can tell us, and then we advocate.
Fantastic. So, Dan, tell us a bit, though, about independent sector and your notion of its place in civil society. I don't think many times we think about nonprofits and the role they play in maintaining civil society. So, give us your impression of what that means to society.
It's a great question. So the way I often answer this is if each of us take a moment, particularly in our pre-COVID days, but even in the COVID days, and think about the number of organizations that are nonprofits that touch our lives, whether we're donating, whether we're involved in some kind of a faith tradition and have a formal institution, a mosque, a church, a temple to go to, whether we are environmentalists and do a lot of conservation and work with groups to preserve the natural world, whether we're involved in the arts and either go to plays or listen to NPR or public broadcasting. I mean, it just touches our lives in myriad ways, often every day. And so what that really tells us is that civil society is like the air we breathe, especially as Americans. As I mentioned, we're the third largest employer, over $1 trillion of economic life that the sector creates each year. So we are both an economic force, we are a civic force, we're an environmental force, we're a religious force, we're a culture force. And without civil society, we would be deeply impoverished. And what is fascinating to me about particularly American civil society is it has a kind of freedom that you as an individual or you with a collection of folks with a profound shared interest can band together and either formally associate into a 501c3, a nonprofit, or some other kind of C3 or C6 or C7, or you can pool your resources into a philanthropic institutions and you can put your time, your treasure, and your talent in service of promoting the common good. And it has really been the backbone of American life from the very beginning. And it is the heart of our democracy. There's a lot written about how a vital and strong civil society is the place where we learn to engage folks that are quite different than us and learn to compromise. If you think of organizations, even an association. A good friend of mine is in the Miniature Schnauzer Association, and they have members from all over a region. They all vote on who's going to be the board members. They have committees. The committees are often the place where board members learn about the organization and emerge into leadership roles. Those are all little d democracy institution buildings that then translate into our larger political life. And the last thing I'll say is maybe 50, 60 years ago, the nonprofit sector was not an economic force in America. But now, just in payroll each year, the taxes generated is like $650 billion. It's a huge amount of resources that the sector both creates in economic goods, employs people, has secondary, tertiary economic impacts with buying goods and services to support the work of the sector. So it's integral. And the last thing I'll say is during the pandemic, I think we've seen in high relief how incredibly important nonprofits have been. I'll just use one example of the amount of folks who have historically never had to rely on food banks, who had lost their jobs due to the pandemic, the economy shut down, and all of a sudden, they've got to feed their family and they're figuring out how are they going to make this work. And I'm sure you all saw the lines, cars for miles of folks, and they'd be interviewed that had never thought about needing to go to a food bank, now reliant on it. It's just an example where the incredible, in a sense, safety net that the nonprofit community has created during the pandemic. And now as vaccines are rolling out, really trusted institutions that are helping folks who are somewhat skeptical or nervous about the vaccine really have good information, and they place a lot of trust in local leaders who they know and know that these leaders care about their community, and they're playing a really critical role in getting this vaccine rolled out. So without civil society, America would not be America.
And I wanted to ask you about the pandemic and how charities are faring as a result, in your opinion.
So, I think it is, in a sense, a tale of two cities. On one hand, I think nonprofits have done what we've always done, which is, in the face of odds, risen to enormous, courageous leadership in the face of real need in community. So, as I mentioned the food banks earlier, at a time when the demand has just precipitously increased, right? There's just a huge demand for goods and services that nonprofits are often seen on the front lines. It's also been a time when many of these institutions have been economically compromised. You know this well, Art. Many nonprofits receive the majority of their economic income from fee-for-service. And in a time just like restaurants, when folks weren't going to these institutions, they weren't able to charge. Museums are a great example, but even multi-service organizations. So the demand was going up and the income was going down. So nonprofits have been under enormous pressure. I will say there's been some very encouraging short-term responses, one of which was the government independent sector, along with other coalition leaders, advocated to ensure that nonprofits were included this time. Unlike in 08, 09 during the stimulus and the Great Recession, when nonprofits were not included in the stimulus. In this year, in last year, 2020, they were, and that got billions of dollars to nonprofits and also preserved, we think, about 4.1 million jobs. So a critical lifeline to the sector. And so government played an important role. We're once again advocating that that was a good first shot. It is not sufficient. And we're working very, very hard with Congress in this next stimulus package to make sure nonprofits are included. And I would say that, much to my delight, philanthropic institutions, whether they were the commercial donor advised funds or the traditional community foundations or private philanthropic institutions, really reached deep. Many of them gave above and beyond their minimum requirements. And we saw a significant amount of money getting into the sector. And there was a very strong trend on philanthropic institutions to release many of the nonprofits from what would have otherwise been restrictions on how they spent the money, gave them the freedom to use the resources to both survive, and if they needed to be innovative in response to the pandemic, they were able to do that without having to go through any kind of bureaucratic red tape. So I think we learned a lot. We are now in a moment where in 2021, as the pandemic continues, and the good news is we've got a set of vaccines, and there's hope. But the economic impact, I think, is going to last a number of years. And still, the conservative numbers I'm seeing about predictions about how many nonprofits will probably go out of business, we're looking at very conservatively 8 to 10%. I think the number could be as high as 25 or 30% when all is said and done. So we're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. One last point I want to make is that as I mentioned, Tale of Two Cities, the larger, well-resourced organizations had tended to have reserves and tended to have some running room to make changes to accommodate the economic impact. So they could kind of sense either furlough and or right size, and now can build themselves back. The closer you got to community, the smaller community-based organizations, and particularly those that are led by folks of color, tended to be deeply undercapitalized, so had very little running room. And it turns out those community-based organizations were often at the very front lines of providing critical services. So while we may see, globally 8 or 10% conservatively, a contraction in the number of nonprofits, we have deep concerns that it will disproportionately devastate communities, smaller nonprofits, and particularly those led by leaders of color who have historically been deeply undercapitalized.
What would you like to see Congress do to assure that nonprofits are in the best position to serve during this challenging time?
It's a great question. So there are a couple things. The first is immediately, as I mentioned earlier, we want to see Congress sufficiently capitalizing nonprofits to be the civic infrastructure that we mentioned earlier that is so critical to the health and well-being of people today during this COVID recovery moment. So immediate relief, and we see that through the Paycheck Protection Program as one of the ways to do that. There are other things. If you go to our website, independentsector.org, you can see kind of a policy platform there. But it would be using the Paycheck Protection Program with what we learned in the April CARES Act is that there are some real changes that we're making strong recommendations. We're not sure Congress is going to follow those. We would love them to take the learning of what didn't work and incorporate it into this next legislation. So that's one big thing we'd like to see Congress do, provide immediate relief. The second is that we think that there should be a permanent office of civil society in the White House that isn't dependent on who is in office, almost like a domestic policy council. Like there's always a domestic policy council, and different people occupy the leadership of that. We would like to see an office similar to that, or some configuration close to it, where there is a direct interface with civil society. The administration has the Small Business Administration that works with the business community. And in fact, that was how the Paycheck Protection Program got administered. And it was better for the businesses. It wasn't so good for nonprofits because the Small Business Administration has no real understanding of how nonprofits operate. And so we want to see an office dedicated to nonprofits and philanthropy where we're seen as the kind of force that we are, and be a real partner with the administration. So that would be the second thing that we would advocate. So this notion of relief, and then we want to see representation. The third thing we would really love to see Congress do is begin to look at the civic infrastructure and making investments. We know that this administration and the prior administration, along with Congress, are deeply considering how we support the roads and bridges and all the necessary infrastructure for American life to go on. We think that's important. We think similarly, civic infrastructure, from national service to parks and recreation facilities to things like broadband treated as a public utility so that rural communities had access to it, become incredibly important investments for civil society. And then I think the final thing is a sense of where do we go from here? How might, especially with this office in the White House, that we could begin to look at a really proactive partnership with civil society. My experience in Washington is often government looks to civil society to implement its policies, but doesn't bring much of civil society in the policy formulation, in the actual development of good policies, which means that we're often contractors to government without the real wisdom of practitioners brought into how might you set up a grant program to most cost effectively support the communities in the ways that you intend. We look for a kind of partnership over time where the practical wisdom of the 12.2 million nonprofit leaders have a conduit into government and not just as contractors to government.
Perfect. Dan, you've also been in the education space, and I can't pass on this opportunity to ask you not only about your experience at communities and schools, which is the nation's largest and perhaps most effective dropout prevention program, but I also want to ask you, what might you be doing if you were still with communities and schools, especially now, given the challenges that families are facing educating their children at home?
It's a great question. Okay. The good news is that there's even a smarter, more experienced, in one regard, leader at communities and schools, a guy by the name of Ray Saldana, who hails from San Antonio and was the youngest city council from San Antonio. I think he had 5 terms, and I think he was elected at like 24, 25, and a CIS alum, which is what is so important, that somebody who's at the helm of the organization has the lived experience of what it meant to be a CIS young person and what it meant for his family. He's also a former elected official, so he understands the interface between the community, both formal and informal civil society, good nonprofits and volunteers, as well as the incredibly important role of that partnership with government in order to bring the kind of holistic support young people need, particularly in traumatic experiences or events like a pandemic. So I think as I watch Ray in his leadership, what I see him doing is a couple of things. One is the immediate response. Schools had to pivot to this virtual space. So that meant that particularly poor students were in environments where the strategies to support them, virtual learning, might not be as conducive to learning as for middle class or upper middle class or rich kids. And in fact, we know from the research now that that's been the case. The gap that's been created for poor kids because of infrastructure and a variety of other reasons in terms of their falling behind is quite a bit wider than their more affluent and predominantly white counterparts. So they've had to innovate. And so I would be looking for resources for our CIS network to be able to have as much flexibility to innovate and respond to real-time needs. The second thing would be to partner with local, state, and the Department of Education nationally to come up with a comprehensive re-engagement plan. Schools will be one of the first places where students come back, and so ensuring that teachers and kids and their families are safe, well-informed, and there's an integrated approach to ensuring the kids really can, when they show up to school, concentrate on learning. Teachers can be freed up to be able to teach, and particularly the very unique circumstances each of those kids' family are going to be navigating. Many of them are frontline workers and kind of essential workers. Some have been unemployed. So stabilizing the schools. And then I think the third thing I would be looking to is there's no doubt that the experience of the pandemic has kind of accelerated fundamentally the use of online learning and virtual learning. Understanding how a holistic student support strategy that looks at both the academic and the non-academic developmental strategies for a young person gets worked out in a new or increased hybrid virtual world will be an important source of innovation. And so I would be looking to philanthropy particularly to help either identify and or pilot models that will anticipate where it's a sports metaphor, which I'm reluctant to use for many of your listeners, but where the puck is going as opposed to where it currently is.
Well, that certainly would be consistent with how we've come to know you as a person who's deeply embedded in many issues that our country's facing right now. In fact, I noticed also that you spent some time earlier in your career as a community organizer in Guadalajara. It makes me want to ask you, Dan, what I like to ask many of our guests, which is, how did you find your way to the independent sector, small IS? How did you find yourself in community-based work, and what was it in your background that sort of drove you there?
So I grew up in a religiously conservative but socially quite progressive Catholic family where authentic religious sentiments were expressed through a combination of kind of prayerful spirituality and moving in the world, kind of taking care of the widow, the orphan, the stranger in kind of biblical terms. So it was I just don't ever remember a time in my life where that wasn't a part of how I understood faith and how I understood kind of what our family stood for. And so very early on in my life, again, I don't ever remember this not being part of it, we were connected to the Catholic worker movement, which really was a place, a home, the in community, a very, very poor community where folks who were homeless found a community and a home. And we would go down when I was younger and serve. And then we got to know the people there. My folks had been very involved with the founders of the Catholic worker movement in Rochester, where I grew up. So for me, community-based work was always the kind of pathway. And when I went to Guadalajara, I went with a great aspiration to learn the community organizing of many of the really amazing Jesuits who were doing transformative work in Latin America. And what I understood then is that they, while being involved in the frontline work, kind of accompanying the communities as they became aware of the injustices and the systems that held them back, and working with them to kind of develop their own capacity to then advocate for their own work. I was also trained in what was called social analysis, an analytic at the systems that were set up to hold folks down, particularly poor folks. And then I realized that there was a high potential for burnout for frontline folks who were doing organizing. And you had to find out where your gifts were and where you could sustain the work. So over time, as I spent most of my young adult life into my 30s doing that kind of work, and then as I got better at it, and I found myself moving in a sense to the a little bit more abstract, to the regional, national, international level to work in those systems. So that's kind of my journey. And then in terms of independent sector, where I am now, it goes back to the earlier point that I made, that in my own experience is that when the sector is healthy, when it is fully empowered to take up its role, it is actually the driver for a healthy community, a healthy nation. So I'll just use a couple of examples. If you look at the United States, most, if not, well, all of the major movements whether it be civil rights movements, the settlement house, LGBTQ rights, even the environmental movement, and on the right, similar sets of issues, gun rights issues. They all come out of civil society. Many of the best ideas come out of universities or think tanks that have crafted and driven our country in one direction or another. And so when civil society is rich and strong, we get the best of humanity into building our community. So that's what has sustained me at community schools. I think it is a little bit of a tour of duty. Having grown in the grassroots, I think I have an appreciation for and a love for how policies and practices can actually materially change the trajectory of individual kids, families, communities. But, I think over time you can deal too much in the national, and it's always good to get back to the grassroots. So I try, and when I was at community schools, I was often in schools, and I found that to be a very profoundly grounding experience. And this job, I find I talk a lot to CEOs that are living, in a range of organizations, living, particularly in the pandemic, the ups and downs. And I find that helpful.
Dan, what would you say to young or older people, for that matter, who may be contemplating doing work in our sector, either as a volunteer or as a staff person, or just donating stuff, money, or things that they have for the good of an organization? What do you think they would actually get from that? And what should we do to make sure that this happens? And how can we encourage them?
So it depends a little bit on what getting involved means. I think just the very posture of doing something is incredibly valuable. So I would say it doesn't matter where you start, to your point, donating or volunteering or using your voice for an issue that you care about to some local, state, regional, national official. So the one thing I would implore everyone to do is when you are acting, regardless of what you're doing, that you carve out some percentage of your time to reflect on what you're learning, what you're struggling with, what brings you joy. And you cherish that space as deeply important as a kind of a learning or almost like a steering wheel directing how you continue to evolve and grow in your participation in getting involved, whatever that may be. So if you're drawn to tutoring or mentoring students, what works for you? What doesn't? Do you enjoy the kids, or do you find actually it tougher than you thought, but you really enjoy talking to the teachers, and you find that you could actually spend more time supporting the teachers who are really good at working with the kids. So it's the practical experience of whatever you're doing becomes deeply humanizing for individuals and tends to then direct them to where their gifts are stewarded in a way that both allows them to flourish and grow, and in the process they just add to the common good, to community in a way that I think is their unique gifts. And we need the full complexity and range and beauty of humanity kind of all individually and collectively flourishing.
Dan, let me shift just a minute, because recently I had David Eisner on as a guest. David is the CEO of Convergence, and you'll remember him for the work he did at AOL and other places, the Corporation for Community and National Service, for example. We had a great conversation, and one of the things we discussed was how fractured our nation is ideologically, and how important it is for us to find ways to bridge these divides, to get people talking to each other. And then I see this note that you put out to our community, our independent sector community, about the importance of inclusion over sectarianism. And you lead off by saying, despite recent calls for unity, we are at a moment in our nation where competing visions of our future are in constant tension. And that rather than unity, I've been wondering if we shouldn't aim for inclusion instead. Would you tell us a little bit more about what stimulated that thinking for you and where you take it?
Sure. What stimulated the thinking was an article in Science back in October, written by 17 social scientists. So Science is a serious journal, and 17 social scientists is a formidable group of researchers who identified something in an acute and deeply analytic way that I had been feeling and slightly intuiting, but couldn't put a frame to. They called it political sectarianism. And at the heart of it, they were diagnosing kind of three trends that were leading to this very challenging moment. They talked about this kind of powerful identity grouping that's happened over the last 30 or 40 years. Many folks have written about this, I have as well, around this notion of a growing mega identity, that you're really divided into a Democrat, a Republican, a progressive or conservative, a liberal camp, and that your identity gets crafted by that community. And as that community's identity shifts, you can shift your other identity markers. And I'll quote you what they say in the article. It's really quite stunning. This mega identity can grow so powerful that it changes other identities, as when partisans alter their self-identified religion or class or align with other political markers. So it struck me as a moment where your belonging was something at the kind of self-understanding level. The second trend they noted was something that we read a lot about, this notion of an ideological echo chamber. I use a different term, heuristic echo chamber, but the point being is that through social media and other kind of channels, even broadcasting, cable news, we get kind of self-reinforcing points of view that really exclude other points of view or other takes, and they tend to be linked to this mega identity. And then the third really kind of startling to me notion was this notion of how this elite reinforcement of the extreme camps. And it really went to the combination of how over the last 25 years we've had this extreme and growing extreme inequality where a fewer and fewer folks control larger and larger resources. And you marry that force with the continued role that large donors play in our political life. So our politicians are more and more beholden to the large donors who have very strong ideological points of view. So you get this very potent combination of David Brooks talks about centrifugal forces pulling us apart into particular camps. What results, according to these scientists, is this notion of political sectarianism. And they use three very simple ways to point to it. They say if you're seeing your group otherizing the other group, that is the tendency to view the opposing partisan as essentially fundamentally different or alien to you. So otherizing is one characteristic. The second is aversion, the tendency to dislike and to distrust. In other words, there is nothing good that they have to say, and I don't believe that they are dealing with facts or have a lived experience that is valid. And then the third, so you have otherizing and aversion. And the third element is this notion of moralizing. And this is the one that I think kind of stopped me dead in my tracks. It is, quote, the tendency to view opposing partisans as iniquitous, sinful. In other words, not only are they other, and not only don't I trust them, but they in fact are sinful. And so what the article made me realize is that we have potentially stepped into a moment in our American life in which there are forces larger than ourselves pushing us all the time to belong, have to pick a side, and then that the force of belonging to that group is over and against the otherizing and the dehumanizing of those in the other camp. So this, I think, is for many of us descriptively true. As I reflected on the article and when I wrote this piece last week, I was appealing to what I think are some forces of hope. And there is such a movement in the United States right now for us to step into a deeply honest reckoning with our racialized caste system that has really completely and thoroughly organized our country. And there is broad-based willingness to name it and a growing sentiment to do something about it. I call it a reconstructive sentiment. And the shorthand folks use is diversity, inclusion, and equity. And in the conversations, you hear a lot about diversity, which I think is critically important. And there's a lot people talk about in terms of equity. and we have a long way to go. What we don't spend, I think, as much time that directly responds to this article is this notion of inclusion. That is a culture of belonging that does not exclude the other, even when you deeply disagree. And so, as I reflected, it felt to me that we had, by over rotating, as it were, on the D and the E and under rotating on the I, we were missing a fundamental key to this political sectarianism that we find ourselves in. So I was just trying to highlight for folks, for conversations like this, where we could say, how much time and what is our internal work around really being inclusive while not having to give up, and I don't think you do, on your deeply held beliefs around a diagnostic of what's going on. But when you can treat the other as disposable, or you can vanquish them around political victory, then it's a spell for disaster. And let me just tell one anecdote that I think helps at least the listeners understand where I'm coming from. When I was a very young man, I left college. I was at Georgetown, the School of Foreign Service, and I left after my freshman year, and I was very enamored of the social change that was going on in Central America, particularly Nicaragua, where the Sandinistas in 1979 had overthrown the Somoza regime, which was a deeply oppressive dictatorship that exploited massive numbers of people, both economically and in other ways. I was there in the 80s, the mid 80s, and what became quickly apparent to me is that there was this, using the language I just did, deep moralizing and otherizing of the Contras. So there was this Contra-Sandinista war. And there was no reflective practice or no set of values that looked to the Contras or the Sandinistas as human beings, but rather as the enemy to be vanquished. And now, 35 years later, you look to Nicaragua and the Sandinistas look almost identical to the Somoza regime that they overthrew. And so I think it's for me, a important life lesson that we have to be exceedingly careful in how we go about driving substantial social change. It's necessary and critically important and urgent. So people often say, well, are you talking about incrementalism? I'm really not, but I'm really calling to a kind of discipline of radical inclusion of the humanity of those we would otherwise otherize in order to be able to keep ourselves from repeating history.
So, Dan, as we wind this interview down, I want to ask you, what role do you think nonprofits should play in helping us create the inclusion that we need and that you talked about? And I know it may be early. You just wrote the article last week, so you may not have had a whole lot of time to think about it. And the second question is, should we be optimistic that we'll actually get there?
So let me start with the optimism. I am enormously optimistic because I think in civil society, we have the capacity to tap the sentiments of the common good as a corrective, as it were, for what could otherwise be political sectarianism. Once you put the notion of the common good, if you're serious about the word common, then you have to include those that are part of the community that you may not want to engage with. And I have seen this over and over again. I'll use examples like national service or volunteerism, where folks, for similar sentiments about serving their fellow community member who may be suffering, may be working side by side with someone they would otherwise never encounter. And if they've dug, they might find absolutely unacceptable from a political or ideological point of view, but the shared experience of loving and caring about community can, I think, be these powerful forces. And I see that alive and well. We have 63 million volunteers. So there is hope. I think there has to be intentionality in attending to this. And hopefully, I'm not the only person out there kind of talking about these things. But I want to make clear, because often this is seen, especially as a white, middle-aged male leader, as a veiled way of saying we should take our foot off the gas of the kind of social change, the racial reconstructing that we need to do, the kind of addressing of the inequities around economic goods and distribution of resources. I am not. But I'll end with my tale about Nicaragua. My experience tells me unless we proceed very carefully as we do this incredibly important and dramatic reconstruction, we will repeat history. And I don't think any of us are in this for that.
No, that's true. And we don't want to repeat history. And yet, I hear so many conversations these days about how activists and organizations need to figure out how to work better together. And I hope we can. There are many of us who think that it does take a long time to get things done, and we need institutions to be there to do that work. And certainly there's room for that. And we also need the activists or those who advocate for change out there. And by connecting both of them, we get progress. So, Dan, listen, I really want to thank you for giving me this time today and sharing your thinking with us and helping us appreciate the great work that's going on at Independent Sector and for the professional that you have been. I really appreciate you giving of your time and your career to causes that matter to you and in our society. And I really want to thank you and all of our listeners for this real treat today that you've given us.
Thank you, Art. Thanks for your fine work. I look forward to our continued conversations.
You're listening to the Heart of Giving podcast. I'm Art Taylor. I hope you'll tune into our next episode. You can find us on all major podcast platforms.
You've just listened to the Heart of Giving podcast with Art Taylor. Be sure to tune in next time for a brand new episode. To listen to our other interviews, visit heartgiving.podbean.com. That's heartgiving.podbean.com. Subscribe to our show on major podcast platforms. Send your comments and ideas to nona@thusmarket.com. That's Nona at thusmarket.com. The thoughts and opinions expressed on this podcast are the views and opinions of the guests, not those of the BBB Wise Giving Alliance or program affiliates. This podcast is for information and educational purposes only and is copyrighted with all rights reserved. This podcast is protected by Podbean's terms of service.